I'm Logan Crawford, and right now on Spotlight, we're diving into a terrific book. It is called Since Dorchester, and it's written by a wonderful author. Her name is Judith Kirwan Kelley. This compelling memoir offers a unique perspective on growing up in Dorchester, Massachusetts during the 1960s, which, of course, was a time of significant socio-political upheaval. Judith captures the essence of life in a changing America, blending humor and insight as she reflects on her experiences during one of the most transformative decades in American history. We're delighted to have this wonderfully talented author join us here today on Spotlight. We thank the team at Atticus Publishing for helping us put her in the spotlight today. And we ask viewers like you to support authors like her by subscribing to our channel and by purchasing her amazing book. The links are below this interview. Judith, thank you so much for joining us here today on Spotlight.
Thank you. Good to see you.
Good to have you on the show. Since Dorchester is a terrific book, it's a memoir, but it's also kind of a telling of history of a very turbulent time in American history. Why did you decide to share your experiences of growing up in Dorchester?
It was never a question. I have been a writer since I was about 8, and I just always felt the passion to write. And I also loved growing up in Dorchester. It was all that I knew, but once we even left Dorchester when I was about 13, 14, I never wanted Dorchester out of my system. So Dorchester has always been a part of my life, very, very unique part of my life, very special part of my life.
Tell us a little bit about the character of Dorchester. Is it an affluent area? Is it a blue collar area, a gritty type of area? Give us a feeling for what it's all about for the folks at home who haven't read the book.
It's very interesting because it really would depend on who you asked and when you asked that question. When I was growing up, I was born in 1954 and was born in Dorchester. It was very much, even then, a very blue collar neighborhood, hardworking, a lot, very, very, very many immigrant families, mostly of Irish descent, living in Dorchester. And we lived in a very stereotypical family, being especially Irish Catholic, of numerous children with the father out working and the mother at home taking care of the children. More children born every year, just about, and many of us attending Catholic schools since we consider ourselves Irish Catholic, not just Irish. And it was a great place to grow up. It was the kind of dense neighborhoods. Your best friends either lived in the apartment above you, the apartment below you, the triple decker next door, the triple decker across the street. And there was always somebody to play with, even though I had many siblings. Outside of the family, we had lots and lots of friends, very similar backgrounds.
Yeah, it's kind of one of the last great eras for, I think, the nuclear family, where mom was still at home. When you came home after school, she was there. She had a snack for you. She was making dinner. Dad would come home at the end of the day. I grew up in a very similar background, Irish Catholic as well, Catholic schools, same era. So I can completely relate. And obviously, a devastating time for us Catholic Americans and all of Americans was the assassination of JFK, who was not only a national hero, but an Irish Catholic hero and a Boston hero. Tell us about the impact that death had on your life and on the community around you.
Well, it's actually one of the favorite stories that I tell because there were a few things that we had mixed in together. One is that it was a Friday, and for Fridays, there were meatless Fridays in the Catholic Church. We were not allowed to eat meat. It sounds like it's not at all relevant to the story, but it is. My sister and I, my younger sister and I, got the rare, rare chance to stay home. I'm going to put in parentheses sick because we weren't really feeling sick, but we somehow convinced my very tired mother that we were too sick to go to school. And she was not an easy one to convince. At the time, she, around the holidays, would work part-time in the post office sorting mail. So she was tired from that job as well. And so when we convinced her that morning, when she was not going to be home that day, again, very unusual, that we were sick. I think she just didn't have the energy to argue with us. And so she said, okay, you two can stay home, but take care of each other. So, as I said, it was a Friday. My father had a rigid work schedule to which he adhered. He never left the house after, say, 6:45 in the morning, returned home and was at the dinner table at 4:30 p.m., at which time we had our supper every night. In fact, I said dinner. We never called it dinner. But strangely enough, on that particular day, my sister and I were having a great time playing and in the house. And at 1 o'clock, my father arrived home. That had never happened in our lives. That had never, ever happened. So we were shocked. Even more shocking was the fact that he had tears in his eyes. My father was a very stoic person, never cried about anything. So we were very confused by that. And immediately what we thought of was that we had just had lunch. It was 1 o'clock and we had had lunch earlier, a little bit earlier. And when we were making lunch, we were just happy-go-lucky that we were home alone with no supervision. And I had decided to make, my sister and I wanted bologna sandwiches for lunch. Um, Seems odd, except that they were meatless Fridays and we had made an error. So as soon as we started eating the bologna, we were horrified. We were absolutely horrified that we had taken some sandwich with meat in it. And then my father came in and he was crying. So we made what was to us the obvious connection. He found out that we'd eaten meat on Friday, and that's why he was crying. We never saw him cry. We never ever saw him cry. So he went into the dining room, the den, I'm sorry, where the TV was, and he collapsed in a chair and put a handkerchief over his face and kept crying softly. And he put the television on, which was never on during the day. So we were very, very, very upset about it, about that. Obviously, it was the fact that we had eaten bologna that made him cry. But how did he know at work? So it's kind of the selfishness and the self-centeredness of children that if something happens, it must be due to something you did. So I finally noticed that it was really odd that he would have put the television on during the day. Television, we had strict rules, and television did not go on during the day. So I started probing him a little bit, saying, Dad, are you okay? Are you okay? And he wouldn't take the handkerchief down from his eyes. And he started crying and choking. And he said, the president's been shot. And then my sister and I thought, oh, at least it wasn't the baloney. Again, the self-centeredness of kids that age. But then we started noticing what was on the television and saw that, in fact, John F. Kennedy had been shot, and he was the first Irish Catholic president. And in an Irish Catholic community, that was just a tragedy beyond proportions that our president, we considered him our president, was killed. John F. Kennedy had a lot of ties to Dorchester as well. His grandfather was Honey Fitz and Fitzgerald, his a relative of his mother's, and he lived not far up around the corner from us. So we really felt that we owned John Kennedy, that Dorchester owned John Kennedy. And the fact that he, first Catholic president and a young man, had died, it was beyond our comprehension. We immediately realized that the gravity of the situation was, number one, that the president had died, that something could make my father cry, and that it wasn't our fault. So it was kind of a very mixed kind of experience to have to digest all of those things at once. We learned quickly in the community that it was a far greater issue than we could even have imagined.
Well, it was a life-shifting issue for all of America. I think
Right.
America profoundly changed. It's before the JFK assassination and after. It was kind of an end of an age of innocence. And it is profound that your dad sobbed like he did when Kennedy died, because men of that era were strong and stoic, particularly Irish
Absolutely.
Catholic men. They didn't cry very
No,
easily.
not at
Um,
all.
so it kind of points to the gravity of the situation, and you've really captured that not only here in the story you told, but in the pages of your book as well. That wasn't the only cultural shift you saw growing up in the 1960s in Dorchester, or as we like to say, Dorchester. Um,
Dorchester.
the civil rights movement, women's rights, gay rights. Tell us a little bit about how your family navigated all of that, being of Catholic family of,
Mhm.
Irish heritage that is tend to be very socially conservative.
Well, kind of interest that makes my analysis even more thought out is that I was always interested in what went on around me. Oh, I just was one of these kind of really nosy kids who had to have the answer to everything, who had to ask questions just constantly. And I was reprimanded by my parents often for asking too many questions. But I had a need to know. So with all that was going on socially, culturally, etc., I was always very aware of what was changing about women's roles, what was changing in the Catholic Church, of course, what was changing in society in terms of racism. We lived in a very much mixed community. We had blacks, we had whites, we had Hispanics, we had many, many, many different nationalities represented, many new immigrants, many whose families had been there for generations. And it was just normal to us. Part of that, in terms of identification, I have always identified as Boston Irish and as Irish Catholic. And I remember asking my mother one time, my mother she had a kind of a rigid personality, very nice person, very lovely person, but was very much into you are what you are and you're not anything else, and you can't pretend to be things that you aren't. So she felt that since we were not born in Ireland, we were not Irish. And I remember asking her at one point when I was maybe 8 or 9, and all my friends had Irish last names, and some of them had parents from Ireland. And I said, Mom, what are we? She said, we are American. And I said, no, I know we're American, but what are we? We have friends that are Irish. I have a couple of friends that are Italian, and I went on a little bit, and she said, we are Irish. And I said, but Mom, I was very persistent. And I said, we have cousins named Flynn. We have cousins named Canavan. We have friends. And I went on, we have friends named Casey. My best friend's parents were from, his father was from Ireland. And I said, aren't we Irish too? And once again, she said, we are American. So there was that struggle with identity, with what your national identity was. And there wasn't the later transition towards so many of us wanting to know our heritage and doing ancestry.com. And I personally go to Ireland at least twice a year and stay for a week to 10 days each time. So I very much identify with my Irish Catholic heritage. My mother, we converted her later to developing a real appreciation for her heritage as well as her birthplace. And my father had always embraced his Irishness. So that was one part of it. In terms of the other things, I am a sociologist by training. I have a Ph.D. from Brown University in sociology, and it wasn't by accident. I was always so much interested in culture and in people and why people behave the way that they did, and ultimately went my way through college at Boston State College. I graduated from Boston State College, went straight to nursing school because I always had that nurturing part of me as well, being the second oldest of 7 kids. And then just was curious about the world and the changes that we were going through. The women's movement struck me early. It struck me very, very, very early that there was this real dichotomy, but what were considered to be women's roles versus men's roles. And my mother occupied a very, very, very stereotypical women's role. And she was happy with it. Well, she seemed to be happy with it. So I followed that, but started following what were the changes. And the women's movement was really picking up steam at that time. So I really followed the women's movement and became part at a young age of the women's movement. One of the things that profoundly impacted me when I was a little bit older, once we had just moved out of Dorchester, was that of my two best friends, one of them, and this was junior high through high school, so a little bit after Dorchester, as reflected in my second book, which is Since Dorchester, but just in terms of movements, one of my friends was struggling with his sexual identity, and we were very innocent, very, very uninformed, unschooled Catholic kids in the suburbs by then. And I noticed very quickly that other boys picked on him and picked on him and picked on him and called him awful names and called terrible names. And I couldn't understand why they were so cruel to him. So again, we were schooled early on by society, not by school so much. School didn't do anything to protect the kids at that time. And I learned that this was a sexual identity issue. And I have been an ardent, absolutely an ardent advocate of LGBTQIA plus since that time. I even got my first and only tattoo a couple of months ago, and it's a peace sign to reflect the peace movement from that time with the rainbow stripes in it. And I've always been, as I said, a very, very firm advocate for gender rights, sexuality, freedom of sexuality, and also the women's movement. I have three daughters, and they were all raised with those values very, very, very much. And so I always, however I got there, whatever motivated me to be so involved in what was always going on in society, it was there. So it wasn't a choice so much to make my way through those different careers, but a natural path for me, so that I ended up being an advocate for many people.
Very, very interesting that the changes in society are reflected in you and in your family and in the pages of this book as well. It is called Since Dorchester. It's written by Judith Kirwan Kelley. It is a compelling memoir that offers a unique perspective on growing up in this terrific area of Massachusetts during the 1960s, a time of significant socio-political upheaval. A wonderful book, a wonderful read. It is highly recommended. Judith, thank you so much for joining us here today on Spotlight.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
My pleasure. To the folks at home, I'm Logan Crawford, thanking you for your time this time. Until next time on Spotlight.